So let's talk a minute about what's going on in Europe at the time. So World War I sees the collapse of four governments: the Ottomans, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The designation of Russia's Tsar, who was Nicholas II, was unsuccessful at stabilizing the power balance between the rich and the ruling elite. And so the common person in Russia leads the Russian Revolution, just like we see in France. Spain has its own set of issues in terms of revolution, which all was really put into place or got the ball rolling when we talk about the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter Reformation. So it starts with Protestant Reformation and then the Catholic Counter Reformation, and the spirit of revolution and change begins to emerge, leading to World War I, which, like I said, leads to the collapse of four governments: the Ottomans, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. But you also see revolution in France. You see it in Spain. And ultimately, revolution in the United States. The designation of the Russia Tsar, who was Nicholas II, was unsuccessful at stabilizing power. There's a power balance in monarchy between the rich and the ruling elite. And so, if you can't get a handle on that power balance, it gives power to the modern everyday person to create an uprising and overthrow the ruling elite. Ultimately, those ideas lead to revolution, just like the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the eventually Spanish Revolution. In the Russian Revolution specifically, they end up with a communication issue because Russia is so very large. And so that doesn't help the Bolshevik Revolution issue. If you look at this map, you can see where the Bolshevik territory is. You can see that the Orange territories were lost from Finland and areas like Poland. You can see where the major Civil War battles are. Those are the green arrows. Oh, I'm sorry, the red starbursts. And then the white Russian and forces are marked by the green arrows. Revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks take over the country, and opposing forces exist and result in a civil war. The war was quickly ended because the Bolsheviks were willing to give control and the land up. This time of peace ends quickly, though, because Lenin, who is the leader of the Bolsheviks, wants to take over the country, and that formed when they gave up the land. The Bolsheviks are called the Reds, and they're led by Lenin. He develops a new constitution and voids the right of property to nobility, the bourgeoisie, and the clergy, who were really the major offenders of excessive living before the revolution. And his plans give rights to the urban workers and the landless peasants based loosely on the ideas of Karl Marx. At this time, Karl Marx has written the Manifesto, which is a utopian promise of a classless society. And plenty seemed always around the corner, but just out of reach. The Bolsheviks used violence and intimidation to suppress dissident opposition. He is an ex-imperial military officer. They're called the Whites, and they force that. They're the forces that oppose the Bolshevik regime in a civil. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go back a minute. There are a group of ex-imperial military officers, and they're called the Whites, and they force the opposition of the Bolsheviks regime and a civil war ensues. Here is Tatlin's sculpture. It hangs in the corner of a room. Most of Tatlin's sculptures hang in the corners of rooms. He actively uses the open and negative space, and he's really playing with this idea of sculpture being a inherent object. He wants to pull that inherent object apart. So it's almost as if he's a deconstructivist. It's why they call him a laboratory constructivist. He's experimenting. Above all, he wants to really bend art to modern purposes. This particular design was his experimentation at deconstructing sculpture. So another artist from the constructivists was Rodchenko. Rodchenko developed this interior model of the Soviet Workers' Club for the Soviet Pavilion at the Paris International Exposition of Modern and Decorative Art. It focused on the ease of use of simplicity of form and construction, meaning that everything that was there was meant to be there for simple purposes. The chairs, while being beautiful and being objects that seemed somewhat sculptural, were functional, as well as the library tables were functional. They provided a slight slant so that you could prop a book up on the table and sit and read. The focus of the interior design was on ease of use and, of course, simplicity of form. The furniture is made of wood because the Soviet production industry was best suited for the mass production of furniture in wood. So we're going to take a journey back to Tatlin here. Tatlin designed this monument / building. It was a piece of art that continued after the Russian Revolution in 1917 for a small amount of time. It was one of the first buildings conceived entirely in abstract forms. It was built as a model, and the model itself was 22 feet high, and it was displayed in the exhibition of the 8th Congress of the Soviets in December of 1920. It consisted of a leaning spiral, iron framework supporting a glass cylinder, a glass cone, and a glass cube, each of which rotated at different speeds. The building's interior would have contained halls for lectures, conferences, and other activities. The monument was to be the world's tallest structure, more than 1,300 feet tall, but it was never built because the Soviet government disapproved of non-figurative art. Russian supremacy recalls Russian intellects that were drawn from French society. So a lot of the Russian avant-garde scene was based on what was going on in Paris at the time. Now we're going to move from Europe back to the United States and talk about revolution going on in the U.S. The revolution going on in the U.S. had to do with the Harlem Renaissance with African Americans. So the Harlem Renaissance were led by a man named Alan Locke. He wrote a book called The New Negro, and it called for a greater social and political activism among African Americans. Harlem, because of New York City's large growth, becomes wealthier, and so the wealthy middle class settled into Harlem. It was an African American community, and Locke pulled all of them together. He pulled together brilliant philosophers and writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, artists like Jacob Lawrence, philosophers like Richmond Barth and William Grant Still, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ralph Bunche, and John Dewey. Aaron Douglas was an artist of the Harlem Renaissance. He studied art in Nebraska before he went to Paris and finally settling into New York City. He becomes part of the flourishing art scene in the 20s and 30s and part of the Harlem Renaissance. He was encouraged by Locke and Du Bois and others attached to the Harlem Renaissance to explore African art as part of his cultural inheritance. Here, Douglas develops his style of African-inspired art. From what was a very powerful cultural movement that encompasses all fields of art and advocated celebration of African cultural identity and heritage, Douglas was influenced by Cubism and African sculpture and was greatly influenced by folk art themes. He wanted to bring cultural identity to the forefront of his art. He did a series of 7 paintings based on a book of poems by James Weldon Johnson called God's Trombones, 7 Negro Sermons in Verse. Douglas successfully breathed cultural life into work inspired by Cubism and African sculptural motif. Noah's Ark is what you're looking at right now. It's characterized by the formal analytical innovations of Cubism. There's a narrow range of hues, just like in Cubism, but here he uses blues and purples, as well as a narrow range of geometric shapes and a geometric definition of space. There's a sense of transparency in the overlapping geometric forms that define perspective. So as you look at the work of art, you can see that the triangular plane that starts in the upper right-hand corner fades down into the left. You can see the different planes of the large ship, as well as the animals that are part of the story walking into the ship. But you get a sense of three-dimensionality based on the way he shades or uses color in simple planar shapes. In 1934, for the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which is now the site of the Schomburg Center, the most inspirational part of this series was displayed, called The Song of Towers, done in 1934. It was about 8 feet square, and it showed a man raising his arms, a saxophone in one hand, as though to praise the Statue of Liberty, which you can see far off into the distance in the center of the canvas, where the mountain ranges split open and the yellow meets the mountain range. There's a sense of visible distance that soars coming through the canyon of the mountains. And you know what? I'm sorry. I called them mountains because to me they looked like mountains, but as I study them more and look at my notes, they're actually skyscrapers. And so there's something to be said about that. The skyscrapers are so large and so monumental that they seem mountainous. And Douglas intended that. He's trying to get a sense of visual distance, but he's also trying to give you a sense of the culture in which African Americans face at this given point in time in society. African Americans are struggling due to the Jim Crow laws, due to segregation and prejudice. And their ideas and their accomplishments are being overshadowed by white men. And so the opportunity to sort of climb the ladder of success becomes a challenge. And so you get this figure who is praising with music. He's got his hand raised with his saxophone. Music was a very important part of the Harlem Renaissance. It capitalized on jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong, who made great strides in music for African Americans, but for all people in terms of jazz. The skyscrapers are tilted, and there's a sense of hopeful aspiration as he raises his hands up towards the sky. Even though he stands at the top of the cogwheel that looks like a large gear and is praising towards the sky, you see a man behind him who's desperately trying to climb up the cogwheel. In front of him are Industrial Revolution smog, things that are spewing fumes into the atmosphere, talking about machinery, and remembering that New York is a city that has a lot of this type of industrialization, symbolizing that the gears may grind up the accomplishments that have been achieved. This is another one of Aaron Douglas's work. It is, again, a work of art that is done at the end of his career and sort of unnotable landscapes that he's done. He seemed to have a better opportunity doing the images that were celebrating accomplishments. He taught at a university after having some great success during the Harlem Renaissance time with painting. And he led negotiations with the Works Progress Administration to secure federal contracts for African American artists. So he makes a big wave in the world of art, securing equal space or securing space for African American artists so that they have a bigger voice in the conversation about art and technology at the time. This is James Vanderzee, and James Vanderzee decided that he was going to make his mark on the Harlem Renaissance world, or on society through the Harlem Renaissance world, by taking pictures of African Americans in an elite setting. So you have this man who's driving a Rolls Royce. His female friend is standing beside him in a beautiful fur coat with material riches at their sides. Vanderzee settles in New York City and is originally from Massachusetts and establishes a photo studio in Harlem. The studio brings him immediate commercial success as a portrait photographer. And over the next 2 decades, he photographs numerous members of the Harlem community. Vanderzee portrays his subjects as they choose to be represented and remembered through photography. He approaches portraiture more as an art form than straightforward visual record, often introducing theatrical aspects and having his subjects pose with elaborate props and backgrounds reminiscent of the 19th century photographs. With such accoutrements as these long length fur coats, lots of jewelry, diamonds, things that are associated with fashion forward trends, and wealth and substance. Van der Zee was the official photographer for political activist and orator Marcus Garvey. He captured numerous Universal Negro Improvement Association members posing in their military-like garb. Garvey was not in the military. He simply is wearing a military uniform because he is fighting a battle for African Americans. You see his wife sitting in the chair next to him, and his young son who stands in a military uniform also. As a family, they fight for space for the African American voice in society. As a way of saying African Americans have something monumental to contribute to society, that they are philosophers, they are artists, they're creative, and it speaks truth to the African American contribution in society. He often took portraits that he then retouched or used a double exposure to add elements of texture in the work. For example, he would take a double exposure to create a smoky feel or an imaginative feel, which you see here. This young woman's dressed in beautiful, rich dress with a fur-lined collar, and the background behind her seems hazy or foggy or smoggy. It's because of the double exposure. He creates this sort of signature of the double exposure behind the young lady. Not only does he create some unique perspectives in portraiture, like the one we just saw with a hazy background, he photographs famous people. His career ends up taking a bit of a stall after the 1930s because camera equipment gets more expensive and the economy takes a nosedive. But in 1969, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York features a selection of his works, and it was in a multimedia exhibition called Harlem on My Mind. The show took a lot of criticism due to the lack of African American art of the more refined and artistic forms, such as painting and sculpture. But his work was displayed, and he saw a resurgence even through the negative publicity. He sees a growth in demand for his photography. And so famous people come to him asking to be photographed, like Bill Cosby, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Muhammad Ali. And they wanted portraits that were reminiscent of the original portraits that he took. Here you see Jean-Michel Basquiat. He's sitting in a chair holding his cat. Van der Zee photographs, produces... Van der Zee's photographs that he produces spans many decades and have remained central to the visual narratives about Harlem, as well as the glamour style and a sense of progress that defined the historical Harlem Renaissance era. Many contemporary artists that dealt with the issues of racism, tokenism, and the Black experience draw from Van der Zee's work. So he really put his own thumbprint on the artistic world with his photography and his unique techniques that he develops. Jean-Michel Basquiat, who you see sitting in front of you, we'll go over his work later, but he is the son of a Haitian immigrant and a Puerto Rican mother, I believe, and they lived in Brooklyn, I believe. And Basquiat became a very famous artist in the 90s. He worked side by side with Andy Warhol, and used found objects to create very fascinating paintings that were about his cultural heritage and the world around him. Another famous artist of the Harlem Renaissance is Jacob Lawrence. Here you see the Great Migration series panel number 1 during World War One. There was a Great Migration that came. So the Great Migration was a mass migration from the south to the northern parts of the states in the 1930s and 40s. African Americans moved north, hoping that racial tensions would be less pronounced and a hope of a better life. Lawrence was highly influenced by Cubism. You can see the flat planes of color, and he often worked in woodcuts and printmaking. His early works were about African American history. They tended to be small and sometimes had text. He grew up in Harlem during the Depression, and Harlem was the active cultural center that we just got done talking about. He became interested in art as a teenager and got training at art workshops sponsored by the federal government's Works Progress Administration. He goes on to study at the American Artists School in New York. From 38 to 39, he works in the Federal Arts Project and produces some of his earliest major works. He then moves to the MoMA and has an important show that secures his place in the artistic world. Americans tend to adapt the European modernism and tend to bring in more abstracted forms that had been popularized in Europe, especially Cubist forms. He tends to have these rhythmic arrangements that have bold, flat colors and shapes, and they speak of racial tensions in the United States. You can see here in Jacob Lawrence's print number 49 from the Great Migration series, a restaurant that is segregated. The African Americans sit on the right and the white men sit on the left. You can see the gold railing that divides the two sections that sort of undulates back and forth between the center of the canvas. There was lots of hostility between African Americans and whites during this time of the Great Migration. I would say primarily because there was a large influx of migration from the south to the north. And the north really wasn't ready socially to be as progressive as they seemed to be. There was more restrictive housing, more restrictive living, and restrictive working policies. Many experts studied the Midwest to find strategies of exclusion. Migrants were often segregated into the poor housing conditions. They were forced to take on pay that was inferior, and they were discriminated against in the workplace. There was widespread unrest over the conditions of their lives, and during the summer of 1919, race riots ensue. Okay, I told you that. All right, so let's move on to Jacob Lawrence's The Shoemaker. Lawrence tends to sort of have this fine line between abstract and figurative art. He uses aesthetic values for social ends, and he's successful at balancing and sort of oh tension aspects, racial tensions in his art and aspects of it in his art. He really has a body of work that is a wonderful testament to history. He captures the history of the Great Migration. He captures the history of the poor working conditions. He captures the history of racism in his works of art. He has a long and distinguished career. He's one of the first American artists that was trained in Harlem, and he was definitely influenced by Jacob Lawrence. Oh, I'm sorry. He was definitely influenced by Aaron Douglas. And so you can see Cubism tendencies in his works of art. Harlem was where he gains recognition for his art in the beginning, but as he produces more and more art, he is sort of tapping into this mainstream of modern art. And so he becomes big in not only the Black community, but also in the overall art community. And New York really propels his career. Probably one of the most famous pictures ever taken from the American Farm Security Administration is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. Dorothea Lange's career spanned 4 decades. She opened her first studio at the age of 23 in San Francisco. She was married to a painter named Maynard Dixon, but their marriage ended up in divorce because of the hard times of the Great Depression. She gains employment through the Government Works First program, which leads her to work with the Farm Security Administration. The woman pictured here is Florence Owens Thompson. Lange was out photographing in Nipomo, California, which was off of Route 66. And she had been photographing for a couple weeks. And she was just ready to head home after not really photographing anything of good substance. She only had 5 shots in her camera left, and she comes upon Florence Owens Thompson and her children in a camp that was filled with field workers who were picking peas from a pea crop. Unfortunately, the pea crop had frozen, and so they were living off of frozen vegetables that they were picking from the fields and from birds that the children were catching. She had just sold her tires on her car to buy food. And so they were in a really desperate situation. Dorothea Lange recalls the story of the migrant mother. She said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. A photograph from that shoot, not known as the migrant mother, was widely circulated to magazines and to newspapers. And one shoot that we now call the migrant mother was circulated to magazines and newspapers, and it became a symbol of the plight of the American farm worker of the Great Depression. As Lange describes the situation, she and her children had been living in a really awful situation. But later on, Florence Thompson says that Lang didn't speak to her at all and that she didn't sell the tires off of her car. Thompson said that Lang had either confused her for another farmer or established what she had understood of her situation in order to make the story better. So basically, she accused her of fabricating the story. One of the things I want to show you about this image is how incredibly detailed the image is in terms of texture. This is a close-up of Dorothea Lang's neck and hand coming into contact with the child's arm, shirt sleeve, and Dorothea Lang's shirt and collar. When you put all of these things together, you see a wide variety of textures that just really worked together well to create a very emotionally gripping photograph. Now, of course, the expression on Florence Thompson's face was part of that emotionally gripping photograph, but the story would not have been as well described had the textures in the work of art not been quite so beautifully described. Not all of Lang's work had to do with the migrant mother. She photographed bread lines in soup kitchens. This particular photograph was taken in San Francisco during the Great Depression. There was a woman named Lois Jordan. She was a wealthy woman, and she was living in San Francisco, and the homeless people dubbed her the White Angel. She establishes a soup kitchen to feed the needy and the hungry. She had very little outside funding, and she fed more than 1 million hungry men over 3 years. The Works project was under the leadership of Holgar Cahill, who expanded the types of commissions to include a broader net of media, because at this point, photography was the only media they were funding. And so this project ends up funding hundreds and thousands of artworks by 1936 and employed 6,000 artists, either half to 3/4 living in New York. They got a small stipend, which was $23 a week, and it offered Americans the dignity and value and a place in society, but it also wasn't so much money that they could be comfortable living on it. It also helped them form a community to support one another. Artistic communities are really important. We've talked about that in terms of Picasso. For the people in the United States, because everybody lived at least part-time or 3/4 time in New York, Greenwich Village is developed as a hub for visual art. If you weren't associated with a group out of New York, it was difficult to establish a reputation as an artist. Lang originally operated a portrait studio in San Francisco. That's why that was that studio that we talked about that she opened when she was 23. In San Francisco, she was really moved by the homeless population and the unemployed people that she sees standing in the food lines in San Francisco. These particular pictures were what got her the placement with the Federal Farm Security Administration. This also, by Dorothea Lang, is a genre painting. She wanted to capture her subject in a natural state with a dramatic scene of emotionalism. She never considered herself an artist. She considered herself a photojournalist. She was a really shy person. Her subject matter was often the plight of the poor. She photographed the Japanese internment camps in the 50s, and she photographed what she called the New California, which she felt was a documentation of a changing California. So, one last movement here before we wrap up lecture for Unit 1 is American regionalism. American regionalism is a genre that dramatizes the farmer's struggle during the Great Depression. It makes farming seem as if it is a harrowing experience, and it has a total disregard for the contemporary and abstract art. One of the most famous paintings of American regionalism is Grant Wood's American Gothic. Wood was discovered when he submitted this painting to the Chicago Institute of Art for exhibition, where it wins a contest. The prize was $300 and a gold medal, but the museum got to keep the painting. The Evening Post covered the show, and it got instant fame. Wood was classically trained in Europe, and so he called the image American Gothic because of the window that was in the background with the pointed arch. That is a typical symbol of Gothic architecture, the pointed arch in Europe. Wood went to school in Europe, and so including the windows seemed to be homage to his training and schooling in Europe. The male that posed as the model for this painting was a dentist. He was Wood's dentist. And the female model is Wood's sister. None of the models that posed for this painting posed for it together. It was supposed to pay homage to Wood's hometown in Iowa. But when the Iowans saw it, they were not happy with the painting. In fact, it was so poorly received that Wood actually got physical threats for the painting itself. Iowans felt that the wife wasn't presented in a positive manner. It was originally thought to be a satire of provincialism in the United States. But now it's considered a celebration of the spirit of the American morale and American spirit. Wood said that there is satire in it, but only as there is satire in any realistic statement. These are types of people I have known all my life. I tried to characterize them truthfully to make them more like themselves than they are in actual life. I would say that this image by Benton probably embraces American regionalism a little bit more intensely. A lot of you like the painting by Joe Jones in the Columbus Museum of Art. You wrote about it when we did our last writing project there. So let me tell you a little bit about Benton. Early in his career, Benton was a draftsman for the U.S. Navy. It led him away from European influences and towards realism. Benton teaches for many years at the Kansas City Art Institute, and he was Jackson Pollock's teacher. His painting tends to have a bit of a rhythmic flow. His style was bold. It had bold colors and strong lines. And the characteristics in this painting have an almost caricature-like appearance. It's a scene from Missouri. Benton's paintings are famous for showing ordinary people doing common things. So here they're threshing the field and tying up haystacks. He drew and painted portraits, landscapes, and scenes of people at work in farms, factories, and busy cities. He is best known for his works that are public murals. This particular image, Benton captures the farm hands and the farm help pulling in the wheat crop in Missouri. You see that the canvas sort of takes on this unrealistic feeling to it in terms of the shape of the land. It has a sense of cartooniness to it. It reminds me of something you would see by Warner Brothers. It has bright colors and bold shapes. Most of you, whenever I asked you to find a realist painting, told me that the Joe Jones painting at the Columbus Museum of Art was realism. Because you associated this type of work, this backbreaking farm work, with the type of subject matter that the realists focused on. While this isn't a realism painting, I do see that the subject matter feels like it would fall into the realism category. The difference between a realism painting and this type of painting has to do with that cartoony, bold shapes feeling. It sort of has a not real, it sort of has this setting that feels like it's somewhat imagined. You can see that through the lines that the shapes create and how dramatic and flowy the lines feel.